Counterinsurgency Challenge, a parable of leadership and decision-making in modern conflict.
So that's my new book, which is which is great. So if you want a real good cure for insomnia, just click on Amazon, buy that one, and you'll have no problem sleeping at night. It's really great being here. It is the first time I've been back in Madison since 1996. So yeah, I love Wisconsin. Terrific experience here in the university, and so it's nice being here. I have to caveat everything with what I'm going to give you are my personal experiences and then my personal opinions about things. I'm not like speaking on behalf of the U.S. government or the undersecretary or anything. I've stayed engaged on Afghanistan and Pakistan. I like to say it's the sort of gift that keeps on giving. For about the last 6 or so years. I went back to Afghanistan in 2009 with General McChrystal. I was an advisor to him. I wrote the McChrystal report, which was leaked by, it's up on the Washington Post website and everything. So that was exciting. And spent about the next 16 months there as an advisor to Generals McChrystal and Petraeus. Now I advise the Undersecretary of Defense, the Secretary of Defense on Afghanistan, Pakistan strategy. So I'm happy to engage in both discussions of past experiences as well as what's going on today, and answer whatever questions you might have. But once again, they'll be kind of my personal opinions. But the focus will be kind of looking in depth at some experiences that we had in Kunar and Nuristan. And I'll talk much more about the social, political, and cultural aspects of that experience, rather than the sort of the pure military aspects of it, because they're all interconnected. And one of the things that we found, if you want to be an effective counterinsurgent, it's not about killing and capturing a lot of people, and it's not necessarily about winning hearts and minds. A lot of it is just about how well can you work together with all of the actors in the environment, friends, adversaries, and those in between, and how well can you use the resources at your disposal to affect the cost-benefit calculations of the various actors and try to create some degree of unity of effort and commonality towards stability in these areas. So I'll talk about this sort of 15 months that we had. I'll also use some examples from later experiences in Afghanistan as well. This is kind of where we operated up here in the far north, so up in the red. Is northern Kunar province, so here's Kunar province, Nuristan province. The Army and its great penchant for acronyms. This is what's called the sort of N2KL area. So N2 Nangarhar Nuristan, Nangarhar here, Nuristan up north, K for Kunar, kind of here in the center, and then L for Lagman. Anybody seen Restrepo?
Yeah.
Okay, so that took place right about here. So outside of our area, but close to it. ABC News correspondent Jake Tapper, anybody familiar with him? Yeah, he's got a book coming out, released about Veterans Day, which talks about Camp Keating, which is one of our former places. So you can fact check me, if you want to read the Outpost. It's actually a really good piece of work that Jake Tapper put together, kind of tracing the evolution of that outpost there. So we were up here in kind of northern Kunar, eastern Nuristan. Just to orient, Jalalabad is here. This is the Kunar River Valley. Chitral is out here. Peshawar is here, and Kabul is right about there. So just to kind of orient you to where we were. I think I lost a slide. Hang on just a second. I gotta unhide that copy. When we first came into the environment starting in about May of 2007, our mental model of what was going on in that area, and Americans had just recently been in that area since probably the fall of 2006. And our initial mental model, and what we'd been told was the sort of nature of the conflict there, was it was primarily a cross-border insurgency. That militants from Pakistan would, once the snow melted and the mountain passes, would come from Pakistan into Afghanistan and begin harassing the population and undermining the ability of the Afghan government to get things done, undermining the ability of the coalition to get things done, disrupting development projects, et cetera, and so forth. And when so that would happen during the so-called fighting season or campaign season. And then when the snow would begin to fall, in the mountain passes in the late fall, early winter, they would then move back to Pakistan to sort of rest, refit, and get ready for the next so-called fighting season. So with that as an initial mental model, if you're trying to protect the population and prevent the militants from undermining the government, undermining your efforts, then naturally you would focus kind of on things like border interdiction. You would focus on fighting and defeating the enemy forces before they got into the population, and so you could allow governance and development to take place. And so we spent probably about the first 60 or so days with that mental model, and just to kind of give you a key on the map. Red, we often code things red, amber, green. So red, places that are under sort of Taliban HIG adversary control. So there's a lot of those on this map. Amber areas, places that are sort of contested, and then green areas, places that are under government control. And there's not a whole lot of those in May, June of 2007. So I sort of described our initial mental model and and our initial focus. And as so often is the case with conventional wisdom, it was desperately wrong. We were not fighting. And oh, by the way, this is one of the most violent areas of Regional Command East, one of the most violent areas of Afghanistan at that time. From September of 2006 until September of 2007, so in that 12-month period of time, there were over 30 Afghan and coalition force fatalities and scores wounded. So in terms of where those violence levels rank within the rest of Afghanistan, it was right at the top. So we took a look. We operated under the conventional wisdom for a while, and over time, things just didn't seem to quite add up. You would think that if this was truly an invasion from Pakistan by militants, that levels of violence would be relatively consistent. But what we found is during the harvest season or during the planting season, levels of violence tended to go down. And when you were between those seasons, levels of violence tended to go back up. We could hear them talking on walkie-talkies, insurgents talking on walkie-talkies, and they spoke the very local dialect, especially up here in the Kamdesh area of Nuristan. They would speak Kam Nuristani in the local dialect. Nuristani is a very unique language. It has its unique dialects. There's no alphabet to it. People tend not to learn it unless you live in Nuristani villages. And the same way in northern Kunar, there'd be local Gujar dialects, there'd be local Pashto dialects. And so as we began piecing a lot of these different things together, and the fact that we couldn't there were hardly any local Afghans that would work on any of the outposts. We very rarely, there were no existing relationships with the elders, and they would very rarely, come to, had very rare interactions with them over the first 60 days, and the folks we took over from didn't either. As we began piecing all of this together, we kind of figured out, very quickly after, a lot of violence and some huge firefights ranging from 10, 50, 150 militants in a given fight, very well armed, very well trained, that our conventional wisdom was wrong, and we needed to reassess. So, as we took a look at what was the nature of the conflict in this area, We came to the determination that socioeconomic dislocation and political disaffection were really at the heart of this, this environment and the violence therein. This was not primarily an insurgency that was motivated by ideology. It was primarily motivated by these kind of factors, and I'll break this down just a little bit. Significant economic deprivation in this area. Barely 1 in 10, maybe 1 in 5 military-age males were employed in the Kunar River Valley here, and as you got into the capillary valleys in both Kunar and Nuristan, those employment rates outside the subsistence farm were maybe 1 in 10. You had extremely low rates of literacy. Maybe 1 in 10 military-age males could read and write. Schools generally didn't operate. You had a significant atomization of society. One of the things that we found over time, as we sort of look back historically and learned about the environment over from a perspective of about 30 years or so, the society there in northern Kunar and eastern Nuristan, and indeed in other parts of Afghanistan too, had begun to come apart. And the normal local governance mechanisms of shuras and jirgas making decisions for communities had begun to fall apart, and local militants had begun to take control of the population. We had significant inter-ethnic, inter-clan, inter-tribal friction. This place was a psychodrama of local frictions. We had 4 major ethnic groups in the area: Nuristanis, Kohistanis, Pashtuns, and Gujars. And about the only thing that Nuristanis, Kohistanis, and Pashtuns could agree on is none of them liked the Gujars. They said that they were, not real Afghans, that they were actually Pakistanis and land thieves, and et cetera, and so forth. In fact, I was reading this book while I was out there called Kafirs of the Hindu Kush, written by a gentleman named Lord George Robertson back in like 1896, and I sort of scratched my head at these characterizations of the Gujars, who seemed perfectly reasonable people to me. And sure enough, there's a reference in there that the king of Chitral at the time got really upset at the Nuristanis for some issue, and sent a lot of Gujars as migrant farm workers into the area to sort of squat on land. And so what would happen is the landowners in this area would like the fact that the Gujars were there to be migrant farm workers, to till the land, to tend the sheep and the goats, etc. But then the Gujars would begin to plant roots. They would accuse them of being land thieves, etc. They would throw them off of their land, and then by the time the next harvest or planting season came around, they realized, hey, these guys are pretty handy to have around. So then they invite them back, and you'd have this sort of on again, off again human displacement from a lot of these different lands. Within some of the different ethnic groups, so for instance, within the Pashtuns, we had Wishwani Pashtuns, Salarzi Pashtuns, Momons, Mamoons, and some Shinwaris. All of them had their own histories and their own dramas and conflicts. Within the Nuristani ethnic group, we had a number of tribes: Kam Nuristanis, Kata, Y, and Kushtus. The Kam and the Kushtus had a long-standing blood feud, fighting over 2 wells in this particular area in southwestern Kamdish. They had been fighting for nearly a century when, in the late 1990s, the Kam managed to push the Kushtus off of the own dramas and conflicts. Within the Nuristani ethnic group, we had a number of tribes: Kam Nuristanis, Kata, Y, and Kushtus. The Kam and the Kushtus had a long-standing blood feud, fighting over 2 wells in this particular area in southwestern Kamdish. They had been fighting for nearly a century when, in the late 1990s, the Kam managed to push the Kushtus off of the land and off of the wells, and the Kushtus and the Kam had been fighting ever since. Within the Kam tribe, we had a number of different clans. Merikdari, Sukdari, Garakdari, Utadari were the 4 major clans. And they all had their special dramas and frictions. Politically, it's very interesting. it was also not not uniform. During the Soviet war, most of the Nuristanis were followers of the Hig. In fact, if you ask them today, "Are you Hig?" they say very proudly, "Yes, I am." And we fought the Soviets very hard back during the Soviet war. Very proud of being Hig. There are also Nuristanis in this area of northern Nuray districts, or northern Kunar, who followed a gentleman named Muhammad Anwar Amin, who was part of the National Islamic Front up in that area. And Muhammad Anwar Amin and Gulbuddin Hekmatyar hated one another. And because of that friction between these two leaders, the Nuristanis in Kamdesh proper and the Nuristanis in northern Nuray didn't get along either. And those frictions and feuds existed to this day. The Nuristanis also didn't really appreciate the Mushwani Pashtuns and the Gujars. Back during the Soviet War, the Mushwani Pashtuns and the Gujars allegedly teamed up with the Afghan Communist Army to invade Kamdesh and create what the Nuristanis believed would be Gujaristan. Well, the Gujar tribal elder was killed right about here by Muhammad Anwar Amin's fighters. So Muhammad Anwar Amin was killed back in 1996 or so, he believed by Hague operatives from Kamdesh, and his son, a gentleman named Mohammed Nasir, who's perfectly likable chap and a local businessman, whenever he would want to bid on a development contract or have some sort of business arrangement in the Nuray area, first of all, the Nuristanis wouldn't really appreciate it, but also the son of the Gujar tribal elder who was killed back during the Soviet War, would also scream bloody murder. Heck no, this guy shouldn't get anything. He's a criminal, etc. So those frictions that manifested themselves during the Soviet War and even beforehand were still manifest. They're still manifest today. There are also religious friction points in this area. Most of the Afghans here were Tabligh Hanafis. And up here in Kamdesh, you had Panjpira Hanafis. And then up further in Barjamatal, so sort of further north, you had a lot of Wahhabi Muslims. Now the way, you all are more expert at this than I am, but the way the locals would explain the difference between the Tabligh Hanafis and the Panjpira Hanafis is that for the Tablighs, the job of the mullah was to essentially convey the text to the congregation. For the Panjpiras, the job of the mullah was to interpret the text. And so you had much greater degrees of politicization here in Kamdesh than you did maybe in northern Kunar and the Nuray areas. So that began to texture how we dealt with the mullahs and the Malawis in that local area. So why is all that important? Well, one of the things that would often happen, and we've seen this not only in this area, but we'd seen that in a few other areas, is, let's see, I'll pick on Brett, right?
Yes.
And Madison. Okay, so, with all of these different friction points, let's say Madison is the, sort of new U.S. commander in this area, and Brett is is a local elder, and Brett and I have a blood feud. And I think everybody's familiar enough with Pashtunwali to understand the importance of blood feuds. If you or your family was disrespected, you were duty bound to exact some retribution on the individual who disrespected you. So what would often happen is Brett and I would have a long-standing blood feud, but Madison wouldn't know that because Madison's relatively new to the area. So I would come up to Madison as a friendly elder and I would say, Madison, it is wonderful having you and the rest of your Americans here in this area. We are so glad to be working with you, and we hope you have a really nice time here. And so I begin to start building a relationship with Madison, and doing everything I can to probably try to undermine Brett in the process. And then over time, as Madison begins to trust me a little bit, I say, look, Brett, he's a Taliban. And one of the things that Brett is going to do is he's going to have a hoedown at his compound in about 3 days, and they are then going to attack your outpost. And if I'm really smart, then I'll have Professor Mark, who will also come up to Madison and say, Madison, guess what? Brett's in Alabama. He's going to have a hoedown at his compound in 3 nights, and he's going to come attack you. So Madison's thinking, I always thought Brett looked a little funny. I always thought that maybe there was something not quite right about him. And now I have actionable intelligence that confirms that Brett is in fact a ne'er-do-well. Now Brett's really not a ne'er-do-well. Brett and I just have a blood feud. Now I know that if I take my retribution on Brett or his family, what's he going to do to me and my family? He's going to do the same thing, and this is just going to go back and forth. But if I can get somebody else to take out my retribution on Brett, I look like a genius, and the blowback doesn't come to me, it comes to Madison. So Madison by this time is convinced that Brett is an absolute ne'er-do-well, and begins to look very carefully at Brett's compound in 3 nights, and sure enough, oodles of people are descending on Brett's compound. Some people look like they're they're packing heat. They've got weapons and everything like that. And Madison's getting pretty excited at this point. I've got actionable intelligence. I now have confirmation that Brett is a ne'er-do-well, and he's having all of these militants congregate at his compound. So Madison may have a jet overhead, may have a big operation planned, and suddenly there's a bomb strike or whatever on Brett's compound. Madison's feeling pretty good. I just defeated all of these militants in my area. And then she finds out the next day when a bunch of Brett's family members come by and says, Madison, what are you doing? You just killed a bunch of civilians. And Madison says, no, I didn't. I killed a bunch of militants. Brett's a militant, and so were all the people that were at his compound. We even saw them carrying weapons. And they say, no. Brett was actually having a wedding party, and you did have armed people there for the celebratory gunfire, after the fact. And so what what Madison thought was a perfectly legitimate target turned into a huge incident of innocent civilians being killed because of these kind of information asymmetries that Madison didn't quite know about. And me, as somebody who's got a score to settle with Brett, used international forces in order to do. So that's why me understanding local society and culture and history is absolutely critical. We found that what we called the enemy was certainly not monolithic. They were not all Taliban or all Hig. Every individual group in every valley and every community had a unique set of dramas and issues and circumstances that motivated them to fight. There was an interesting traditional versus new power dynamic. I have a question here: why are so many insurgent leaders from traditionally poor families? Fascinating. I remember I was in a discussion with a group of elders, and I said, "Tell me about this individual." And they said, "Well, what would you like to know about him?" I said, "Well, why is he so powerful?" And they said, "Well, this guy's really not very powerful at all." So I'm kind of scratching my head. This is a local militant leader, pretty significant figure, could bring 100 or 150 well-armed, well-trained fighters to a firefight. My book, that's pretty darn powerful. And they said, "Well, he's really not very powerful at all." And I said, "Well, teach me about this. What do you mean?" And he said, "Well, he doesn't have a big house, and he doesn't own a lot of land. He doesn't have any sons, and he's not from one of the first families of the tribe. Ergo, he's not very powerful." And what they had just described to me was sort of traditional power. And through more questioning, what they explained to me was, look, if you have a big house and a lot of land, then chances are you can be more than a subsistence farmer, and you can begin to show your generosity to the community. That makes you powerful. If you have a lot of sons and a lot of male offspring, then you can bring all of those individuals and their relatives to a given dispute and resolve it in your favor. And if you're from one of the first families of the tribe, you tend to stay in that social strata. So they had just defined for me what was traditional power. What this individual represented was a sort of new power and a rising power. And this guy was a mujahideen leader in the, during the Soviet War. Very charismatic, had access to, he was very good, by the way, had access to a lot of money, had access to a lot of weapons, and was very influential. And a lot of the young military-age males, as they looked at their alternatives, stay with my elders and be a subsistence farmer, join this individual, get money for fighting, and if I'm good at it, I may move up the chain of command to be, powerful myself. A lot of the incentives were working in the favor of this individual, attracting a lot of military-age males toward him. And so a combination of all of those things, plus many others, created this sort of environment in which you didn't just have, and oh, by the way, people didn't really like the government. And up there, this is sort of the West Virginia of West Virginia, very, highly xenophobic area. Very much Nuristan for Nuristanis. You don't tell me what to do, I don't tell you what to do, just stay out of my business. And a lot of Afghan government officials, I was talking to Professor Mark and Rick earlier about the predatory corruption that a lot of Afghan officials, both government officials and security force officials, would engage in. These individuals, especially up in the Kamdish area, believed that the government was out to get them, believed that we were out to get them, and so you didn't so much have a local insurgency here. You had a local popular insurrection, which is what made the violence so very high. So as we continue to sort of think about to learn and adapt in this area and try to figure out how do you be effective in a place where the entire population is at war with you and is at war with the government. It's really in an unenviable position to be in. We began to, learn a few lessons or learn a few things that we start to, figure out how to apply. The first one is I like to call there two iron laws in counterinsurgency: the law of gravity and the law of unintended consequences. We can count on the fact that whatever we do, even with the best of intentions, is going to have a lot of second and third order effects that we don't anticipate. So we have to be very careful about what we do and spend a lot of time understanding before trying to be understood, and a lot of time understanding before we act. We also realize that success in this area isn't about killing militants. You can kill 10, they'll recruit 10 more. You kill 50, they'll recruit 50 more. I'll talk about counterinsurgency math here in a second. Really what it requires is social mobilization, and the extent to which we can facilitate social mobilization leads for stability, and people can see that we can be constructive actors in that common interest of stability. We can begin to gain some traction. And once the population begins to turn against militancy and against instability is when some of the so-called kinetic operations can have lasting effects. But until that point, it's much more about learning and understanding and working together with the population in a common interest of stability. And then, once we understand better, we can begin using the resources at our disposal to affect the cost-benefit equation, to affect people's interest calculation in ways that you can gain some degree of unity of effort. It's not perfect, it's very difficult, but that's what we began to learn. And oh, by the way, that most of these individuals are not hardcore so-called irreconcilables. There are plenty of homicidal sociopaths that are involved in the violence, but most we found were fairly reasonable people with legitimate beefs and grievances. And if we could understand those and work together to begin to address those grievances, or at least facilitate the addressing of those grievances and issues, most of these individuals would no longer have a reason to fight. So the question is, how do take something, of this level of complexity and boil it down and communicate it to people. I had a couple of, pretty smart folks in my, my organization who could put some of this to, animated PowerPoint. And as we tried to convey this to, about 1,000 person organization. So you're going to see a lot of bubbles moving around. Red bubbles, generally bad guys. Yellow bubbles, people neutral on the fence. Green bubbles, people who are on side. This is an example of the Kamdish River Valley or the Landesin River Valley. You can see the mountains in the very sharp terrain. This is the road down here next to the river. And you can imagine that if you're down here and your adversaries are up in the mountains, that you're in a very bad position. You can also imagine the tactical mobility advantage of a local insurgent who is maybe in Shalwar Kameez with an AK-47, a few bandoliers, and we are encumbered with about 150 pounds of lightweight equipment trying to move up and down these mountains. It's a significant emotional event. So we began to try to figure out, in talking with a lot of different elders and people in the local area, what exactly is the traditional Afghan power structure? How do Afghans govern themselves in local areas? And one of the things that we found, and this is going to be fairly crude, but nonetheless, it got us good enough in terms of understanding, is that the elders, the mullahs, the teachers, essentially formed the social nexus of village life there. They were the ones who were, they were elected to, the shuras or the jirgas, who would be, the people who would govern, or that was the governance mechanism of the community. The young men, the youth, the Y bubbles, would listen to their elders and the mullahs and the jirgas or the shuras, and when they became elders, then they got a chance to be voted on that as well. And all of these different communities were relatively self-governing. Up in the Nuristan area, Kafirs, unbelievers, they were late converts to Islam, so they always felt a need to sort of prove their credentials oftentimes. But these villages communities were self-governing. Government doesn't mess with me, I don't mess with them. We leave one another alone and everything is just fine. So you had this very loose connection traditionally with the Afghan government. Over time, a number of significant events began to put pressure on this social system, which, up till that point had worked perfectly well. All the way from the failed monarchy and the attempt to establish a republic, which is then overthrown by the communists. You then had the Soviet-Afghan War. Soviets eventually left. You had the Afghans fighting themselves in the Mujahideen. The Civil War. Then the Taliban, came 1994 to 1996 to impose their own form of Taliban stability. They were in charge from 96 to 2001. Then you had September 11th, the global war on terror, et cetera. And all of these events put a tremendous amount of pressure on the society. I can never do this in PowerPoint, but I have people who can, which was nice. And what would happen is society would begin to atomize in these particular areas. And these local fighters or local insurgent leaders would emerge from the population as beginning to contest the power structure, or may come in from outside, but generally emerge from the population. And over time, with access to money and to weapons, and to inspiring people to fight, they would eventually gain control of the youth. And one of the things that they could do is they would offer young men some things much more compelling than what their elders could offer. A sense of identity. You can become a Hig, you can become a Taliban, you can become a Mujahideen, a holy warrior. If you join my organization, you have this compelling purpose in life to defend your religion, your country, your village, and your family against people who kick in your doors and steal your stuff and incarcerate people. And, oh, by the way, you get a little fun and adventure and pay along the way. And I would ask my 17 to 25-year-old soldiers, do you know anybody else who would be compelled, to join an organization that gave you this very distinct identity, maybe even have your own uniforms, that gave you a compelling purpose in life to, defend your country against all enemies, foreign and domestic, and have some pain and adventure along the way. They're like, that's why we joined the Army. I said, that's why these guys are joining these local militant outfits. So we got to understand that. And once we begin to understand it, then we can begin dealing with it. And things will get even more interesting when you would bring in an outside facilitator, so somebody who could coordinate all of these different groups. Now, this community here and this community here may not get along with one another. They may not have, coordinated much in the past, but when you have, some leadership that would emerge that could, provide money and weapons and training and funding and connect these different groups, you could suddenly, find yourself bringing 50, 100, 150, insurgents to a firefight and doing pretty well with that. And in the meantime, the traditional authority figures were atomized, had lost control of their young men, and were essentially no longer able to govern. So that's essentially, as we deconstructed it and reconstructed it, what we were up against. So as we learned that, we began learning and adapting a little bit more. We came to the conclusion that counterinsurgency, a lot of it is about an argument for the support of the people. And it's not necessarily the people to support you or support a particular government. You had to at least get a common set of interest about stability. In order to do that, we had to begin to understand the nature of the conflict and the drivers of local instability that were unique within various different villages and communities. I would liken it to multi-dimensional chess. The game of chess, very simple, 8x8 board, 16 pieces on each side. Each piece moves by by a specific set of rules. Apparently, the number of possible permutations in a game of chess is like 10 to the 120th or 121st power. This is like multi-dimensional chess, where it's not one simple board, it's many of them. You don't have two actors, you've got, there's us, there's the local insurgents, there's the elders, the mullahs, the local business people, the Afghan government, the Afghan security forces, to name just about 7 different actors, all of whom have their interests, all of whom have things that they want to accomplish. And you don't see the entire board like you do in chess. You see what people are willing to reveal to you, which may be an accurate depiction or may not be an accurate depiction. We found that finding allies is much more important than finding enemies. And we developed this thing called Counterinsurgency Math, where you may have 10 militants, and if you kill 2, it doesn't mean necessarily that you only have 8 left. And if there were civilian casualties involved, or people felt that their honor was violated, then you may have started with 10 and killed 2, you no longer have 8, you may have 20. By the same token, if one good counterinsurgent who builds 10 relationships with people may wind up finding himself or herself with about 1,000 allies. And so we spent a lot of time and energy finding allies and much less focused on finding bad guys. We found that security, governance, and development are intertwined, are all interconnected. You can't just say, it's a self-defeating method to say we're going to establish security first, and then we'll focus on governance and development, because oftentimes the bad governance and the lack of economic opportunity are things that are helping to fuel the insurgency. So we have to understand these things and work them in concert. And we also found that Afghans have to solve Afghan problems. Whenever we would try to solve an Afghan problem, we would get it wrong and they would have no ownership in the solution. If they solved it, and particularly if they solved it through the use of their traditional governance mechanisms, then they had a vested interest in maintaining that solution. Afghans have a great saying, if you sweat for it, you protect it. And as we began to learn that, we spent a lot of time helping Afghans sweat for the things that they wanted to sweat for. and they would in fact protect it. And finally, we found social consensus is the #1 leading indicator of security. So if we could begin to facilitate the development of social consensus around stability, and we could be seen not as disruptors of stability and social consensus, but as contributors towards that, then we could create a lot of alliances of convenience on our own. Didn't mean that people necessarily liked us, but meant that we can contribute toward mutually agreeable outcomes. So what does that mean in terms of the bubbles, Brett's asking? Well, part of this, for us was helping to, in this area, was helping facilitate the recovery of social normalcy and social consensus building. And we found our best way to do that is just work together with local governance mechanisms, with local shuras and jirgas, use our resources and our capabilities and our relationships to try to leverage them to get Afghans to solve Afghan problems and help them get governance back, to a sense of normalcy. So we would often do that through, whether it's through local development projects, if they wanted a school or they wanted a microhydro plant or a road built, then it was the local Afghans that would do all the work for that, but it would first be done in coordination with the local shura. So if it was a project that affected a community, then that local shura or jirga was the ones in charge of it. They would develop the priorities, they would determine who was going to build it, who was going to manage the money, who was going to work on it, etc. We stopped the practices of bringing in outsiders with outside labor to build things that communities may or may not really have wanted. So this is all about local ownership and people determining their own future. If there was a security issue, we would get a report that somebody had a cache, weapons cache at a house. It wasn't us that went and searched it. We would talk to the elders, and the elders, with the Afghan police or army, would go and search that particular place. We even began making agreements, written agreements, with local communities about how we would operate and interact with one another to give a degree of predictability to those relationships, which then began to feed a logic of coordinated effort towards stability rather than instability. And as we began to put a whole lot of different things together, whether it's the governance efforts working with local shuras and jirgas, to local development and economic opportunity, working with young men, having our women work with local women and local women's groups, the use of humanitarian aid and assistance, all of these different things combined began to create connectivity within a lot of these different communities, and began to give people reasons to begin looking to their elders and their shuras and jirgas for governance and for decisions, because then they could begin delivering things that their community wanted for their community. And over time we found that as the elders began to get much more higher degrees of legitimacy in the eyes of their own people, they would begin taking charge of their areas. We had in one particular area up in Kamdish, they developed a 100-man shura. They had about 800 elders come together for about 3 days of meetings where they elected a 100-man shura, and each community elected their own shuras. And I remember talking to the shura leader, and I said, okay. He said, it's our job to bring stability and security to our area. I said, okay, that sounds good to me. How do you want to do this, and how can we help? And he said, I said, are you going to talk to these different leaders and ask them to stop fighting? And he said, no, that's not how it works here. How it works here is we are going to travel as a corporate body, 100 people, to every community in our district. And we're going to talk to the people, we're going to talk to the young men, and we're going to tell them the fight's over, the jihad's over. We are now going to work together to bring stability to our areas. And as we get more and more young men to stop fighting, eventually the balance of power will tip in our favor, and then we'll have leverage over the leaders. And it's exactly what they did. It was actually quite remarkable. And so for the leaders that wouldn't listen, they would kick them out of their communities. And once they were kicked out of their communities and socially isolated, they became much easier to deal with naturally. And so over time, what would happen is, green being good, a lot of these areas would begin to stabilize, and militants would essentially concentrate in areas where, either where they were socially isolated or they could sort of come together. And that made things a little bit easier for us to deal with militarily once they were isolated and away from the population. So, then, once the, enemy is isolated in certain areas, then, when you kill or capture a local militant or leader, they tend not to regenerate at that point. And in fact, you've got the locals on your side for these kind of operations. Ultimately, we developed this method of, talk first and allow the elders to talk. And when they had a group of people they could no longer deal with and who were still inflicting violence on the community, we had a, essentially agreement that, we had to conduct a military operation, with those or against those individuals. And so we could do that with the public on our side. And over time, we would have to work with the Afghan government to begin to reach down to these communities and connect themselves with them, because there was not a natural connection up. That became a, interesting endeavor on its own. And the theory of the case was that if you did all of that and you did all of it well, then you would achieve achieve local stability in these areas. Now, of course, it's much easier to do that on PowerPoint than it is in real life. But that was kind of the theory of the case. And in terms of some outcomes, so this is what life looked like in June of 2007. A whole lot of red, a lot of high degrees of violence. A year later, by July of 2008, the environment looked much different. You still had plenty of red areas in these different capillary valleys that we just really couldn't feasibly get to, except maybe indirectly. But a lot more areas, are green, connected with, and on the side of, the government, or amber, a bit, neutral or contested, but moving in the right direction. I mentioned that first 30 or 12-month period, September of 2006 to September of 2007, over 30 Afghan National Security Force and U.S. fatalities in that area, plus scores wounded. Over the course of the next 12 months, there were 3. In fact, we did not have a major firefight for about 11 months, and did not have anybody wounded due to direct fire for the last 12 months of our time out there. And what happened as levels of stability increased and levels of governance got more effective, you saw prices of goods go down. You saw people much more mobile and able to move from point A to point B. And you began to get a virtuous cycle in the area of people working together rather than working against one another. So this is my last slide, and then I'll kind of open it up to questions. I do think that the idea of cost-benefit calculations trumps hearts and minds, where people generally aren't going to necessarily. It's great if they do. They wound up making me a citizen of Kamdesh and give me an Afghan name, Ahmed, and one of my guys outside there was named Abdul Wali, which was very very gratifying. But oftentimes, it's much more dispassionate. To be effective is much more dispassionate, than trying to win friends and influence people. We found, importantly, that government does not equal governance, and governance is much more important than government. And oftentimes, official government, is not interested in governing, and in fact is undermining governance. And so we had some very difficult, and very delicate ways to deal with that issue. And number 8, beware the law of unintended consequence. We had to be very humble about what we did, be very humble about the actions that we took, and do our best to understand the nature of the environment. And once we did, we had a much higher probability of our actions having results that were intentional and constructive rather than unintentional and counterproductive. With that, I will take your questions about this or about anything, any other questions you might have related to Afghanistan. So